Well, welcome to the show. I'm Ryan McNeice, and we're here at Gonzaga Law School doing the Scholar Series. We're here with our guest, Jason Gillmer. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
A couple points we want to start out with is Professor Gillmer is the inaugural holder of the John J. Hemmingson Chair in Civil Liberties, also the director, the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Started your academic career as a fellow at Stanford Law School.
That's right.
LLM at Harvard Law School.
That's right.
And a major fundamental of this series is the intent of really looking at the depth and plethora of scholarship here within Gonzaga Law School and within our community. And you yourself have written over 25 publications as well as done upwards of 25 presentations. The area of passion and interest appears to be antebellum South, civil liberties. Talk to me about how that passion became yours.
Well, I think, I got into legal history when I was in college, actually. I was a history major. And truth be told, I thought about going to get a PhD in history, but was told by my pre-law advisor that there are no jobs in history. So
I think everybody consistently was told.
Right. So why not go to law school? And so I used my opportunity in law school really to pursue that passion of looking at history, looking at social justice issues. And it's been something that's been with me since I started my career.
Well, and it's pretty evident through the plethora of publications that we discussed, and recently you had a book launch for your new book, Slavery and Freedom in Texas, Stories from the Courtroom, 1821 to 1871. If we could, I'd like to have you expand on some of the respective stories. This book is broken up into what I would call courtroom drama and you digging into the depths of courtroom records to unearth how the psychology and law and social issues and race issues of the time. If you could expand on a couple of the stories that really play out.
Yeah, well, you're right. This is a narrative history, and in the book I explore in depth 5 different trials. Trials that took place in antebellum Texas that involved, in one way or another, a question of slavery, of freedom, of race, of class, of gender. And so it unfolds, these stories unfold as if they were sort of happening before you. So it's not really a book in which I'm maybe following a traditional approach where I discuss facts and discuss holdings and so forth. It's really just an opportunity to read a story. Because these were, after all, I mean, these are trials. And as you know, as a trial lawyer, trials are very much about storytelling. And so I stay true to that form, digging into some of these cases.
Jason, I would actually say that's very true. I think the stories and the parables that you've weaved through these specific chapters lay it out like you'd be laying it out to a jury, trying to understand why each of the respective positions matters within the story, matters with regards to the outcome. Tell us how some of the juxtapositions that were occurring between Caucasian lawyers essentially representing slaves, but in the South during this time period, in Texas specifically, those were some real challenges that potentially lawyers would understand today in a different environment, different names and or social issues, but same psychology.
Yeah, I think that's right. So with these trials and recreating these narratives, part of the project was to get to know the people. And so I'm digging into their own personal histories, looking at census records, looking at tax records, looking at diaries, looking at newspaper accounts. And as you begin to learn a little bit about who these people were, you get to appreciate, I think, the relationships that they developed with one another. So if you're looking down from 30,000 feet, it doesn't make sense, really, that a lawyer from, say, Galveston, Texas, would take on a case in which a woman of color seeks to be free. It doesn't fit with the ideology, it doesn't fit with our understanding of the time. But if you dig down deep and you kind of get to know these people and you understand that, well, they actually lived near one another. This woman's purported owner was an associate with this attorney. And so they no doubt saw each other on a daily basis.
Well, I think the case you're referencing is you have a slave owner that essentially, and I think is described in the book, is not so much a story about his life, but rather a story that develops after his death.
Right.
That through his will, he intends to free his slave and grant assets through his probate to the slave, which raises the questions of the representation, as well as, is this lawful within Texas?
Yeah, exactly. Because Texas was of course, it entered the Union in 1845. It was a republic from 1835 to 1845, and before that, it was part of Mexico. And so, Texas has a very interesting history, but part of that history is Southerners coming and bringing their ideologies and their laws into the state or into the region. So it's very much of a pro-slavery institution, but within that, I think there was a lot of room for people to get to know one another, a lot of room for these relationships to develop. And this particular case, as you mentioned, involved a slaveholder who attempted to free his slave in his will, and he was a very, very wealthy man. And it was challenged, right?
Well, and he's part of the establishment within the norms of that community.
It was challenged, and the laws actually would not have really necessarily allowed for this to take place, because Texans tried to get rid of all the free people of color. And so she needed a really good lawyer who was going to be able to represent her in her pursuit of freedom, and with it, a pursuit of an estate in the city of Galveston, which was quite substantial.
Well, and you'd indicated an interesting concept too in terms of the early history of Texas, where you had essentially Mexico was anti-slavery.
Right.
How did that play into some of your writings and research?
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting part of Texas history that's not always at the forefront, right? When you think about kids going through grade school and into high school, a lot of what they hear about the relationship with Mexico is the Alamo, right? The Battle of the Alamo. What we don't really think about is the battle for Texas independence was at least in part because the Anglo-American settlers wanted slavery, and Mexico did not want slavery. Mexico had its own history when it threw off the shackles of bondage when it had a revolution against Spain. And so it was familiar with these concepts of freedom. And it did not want Anglo-Americans to be bringing in the institution of slavery into the Mexican territory. So I think that they passed laws, they passed restrictions on slavery, and it really was through the political will of people like Stephen F. Austin and other Anglo-American leaders that created opportunities for slavery, and indeed they fought for slavery.
And you probably were seeing this as you were poring over the records and documents within these respective courthouses during your travels of writing and research to see how the political intersection of some of the statutory and legislative combined with the daily reality of courtroom drama.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you can take a look at the Supreme Court cases, you can look at the legislative records from the Texas Congress, and you can see it following a particular path, a path towards slavery. And then you have these pockets of cases that I speak about in the book where I don't know that they're interrupting that path, but they're certainly creating some interesting contradictions.
Well, and bringing light to important issues on the chronological historical timeline.
Right.
Another case that I think stands out to me within the book was the Charles Brady case, where in East Texas, as a slave, Charles Brady, as a slave overseer, had shot Miles, a slave.
Right.
But then the slave owner did not pay the slave overseer. And there again, you have some real issues where the benevolent institution versus an immoral institution of slavery.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
So that's a really interesting case. And I think in the 5 trials that I write about, each of them involves some schism in the social order, some opportunity in which issues of race and class and slavery and freedom come into play. And this is a good example of that. As you mentioned, you have an overseer who's in charge of 35 enslaved men and women. And keep in mind, overseers were that would have been a very difficult job. You're trying to coax labor out of people who have absolutely no interest,
no choice in that.
in doing this. And so overseers were considered of a different class. A different class of persons, but he's got the responsibility of keeping order. So he shoots one of the slaves
to keep that potential order.
To keep that order, he shoots one of these slaves in the back, and
which you would think the slave owner, it would be in the slave owner's best interest, or some idea of that.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the thing, right? Is now the owner looks at this enslaved man who she counts as her property, and her property has now been damaged to the point where her property is not able to perform the services that she expected from him. So what does she do? She fires the overseer. And now the overseer feels that, hey, this wasn't fair. I'm going to sue you for my lost wages. And so now we have a racial conflict that sort of is manifesting itself in the form of class. You have a poor overseer against a wealthy owner. And it's interesting the dynamics that come into play.
Well, the immense psychology and self-interest, social dynamic, as you indicated. That's what I think in this book that just launched is the intersection of so many of these issues. Legal issues are never, as you're describing, never a standalone in a vacuum type scenario. It's the social fabric of the communities and psychology of what's going on during those time periods.
Yeah.
What's the methodology that over the many years, decade in which you researched and wrote this book, what is the methodology that you used in researching and writing this book?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, this was really an effort to uncover very local histories, right? Local stories. And in order to get to know the people, you really have to journey down to these locations in order to really discover who these people were and what the environment was like.
And how they related. You've mentioned this, how they related to each other. What was the as you've described, the intersection between the attorney that's taking the case and the landowner or slave owner, and how that actually plays into it.
Yeah. So it's it's about getting to know these people and what their situation was, where they lived, and so it was a really interesting opportunity for me just to understand more about the local history.
How many towns and communities do you think you visited, and how many courthouses, the depths of the courthouses?
Yeah, boy, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Between the courthouses and the local museums and those sorts of things, I'm probably looking at 20 or 25 different places that where these documents were held.
And I would wager the story within the story. I understand your wife and yourself traveled quite a bit together to these respective areas and did some joint research. So that story in itself, the behind the scenes, is equally fascinating. I definitely want to be able to have an opportunity to chat about some of the extremely important things you're doing here at Gonzaga Law. Again, we're certainly highlighting numerous publications as well as presentations in the area of civil rights, but specifically with civil rights, you're starting and opening the Civil and Human Rights Center.
Correct.
That is something new to Gonzaga and significant for the area and significant in the country.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that launch and what your goals and opportunities are?
So we created the Center for Civil and Human Rights at the beginning of last year. So it's a new program or a new center, but it's something that really ties into the long tradition of Gonzaga University. As you know, the Jesuit tradition of educating the whole person to serve the public good is really who we are as a university and as an institution. So the center is really an opportunity for us to capitalize on that mission, to bring into a coherent program all the good work that faculty are doing, that staff are doing, and that students are doing, and just provide the framework for that, the intellectual framework, if you will, for all that interesting work.
Well, and I obviously compliments to yourself and your colleagues sitting at this table. We've discussed that framework and the scholarly work that is being done that then gives the students the opportunity to take that forth into the community.
Yeah.
What are your ideas with the center to engage not only the faculty and resources here at the law school, but to engage the community to bring light to civil rights issues?
Right. So, you know, there are sort of three main components to the center. Three pillars of excellence. One is a research pillar, one is a education pillar, and then the other is the community engagement pillar. Because that community engagement pillar, as you're talking about, is really, in many respects, some of the most important work that we do, because it isn't just an intellectual exercise. These are real people with real problems, and we're doing our best to help them solve those problems. And so through community engagement, you know, some of the preliminary things we've been doing is, well, holding a conference or holding a citizenship day clinic, those types of things.
Bringing the community in to get an idea of what those issues are.
Yeah, but we're also hoping that we'll be able to expand the center as we grow. And perhaps provide additional clinic opportunities for our students who will then be able to help the underserved in our community. We hope to be involved not just in direct representation, but also the indirect policy making. You know, that's an ambitious goal, it's a future goal, but at some point we want to be, you know, at the table when we're debating new laws. And
well, I think it's actually it's a realistic goal, because I think as you're describing with the different fundamentals and pillars of the Center for Civil and Human Rights is you have the faculty that within these walls is doing the scholarly work, but you are having opportunities to speak to the future lawmakers, private, governmental, nonprofit, legislators. That's where hopefully that epicenter expands. And you yourself obviously are teaching. You teach con law, torts, civil rights. So it appears the very fabric of what you're talking about is you're having that opportunity.
And students too. I mean, I think that's what you're getting at, is the idea that, you know, that second pillar of education is really about educating the next generation of social justice lawyers. So it's classroom opportunities, but it's bigger than that, right? We're really trying to give the students opportunities to think about how they might help the underserved, the poor, and the vulnerable. You know, we've created opportunities, for example, where we're fortunate to be able to fund or provide scholarships for some students to pursue some of these activities. So we had one student last summer who was down on the border of Arizona and Mexico working with undocumented children. We had another one, because we have a global reach, not just a domestic reach. We had another one who was over in Afghanistan, helping to set up rule of law, or addressing rule of law issues in Afghanistan. And we also were able to send 8 students to the International Criminal Court in The Hague as part of our Florence program and our global engagement. So we're really hoping to give students these opportunities. Classroom, yes, but outside the classroom as well.
I think you're illustrating that very well, that those opportunities are starting here on the Gonzaga campus, bringing in the diversity of students from all over the country and internationally. But Gonzaga is providing that core opportunity that then, in my opinion, the lawyer or otherwise needs to take that opportunity and go forth, whether it be locally, whether it be regionally, nationally, internationally. Those opportunities are there, but there's a certain amount of responsibility on each attorney, and like I said, or otherwise, to make those choices to go serve the community.
Right. And you know, we're actually seeing a sort of renewed interest, if you will, from students coming to law school or expressing interest in coming to law school to engage in these types of pursuits. So we always have room at Gonzaga for all students who might not be interested in this. You know, as you know, we have a great intellectual property program. We have a great commercial law center. We've got other opportunities that are certainly available for students. But we are hopefully creating a substantial space for those students who are interested in social justice issues.
Well, as you said, educating the full person.
Right.
Whether you're solely, or you think you're solely interested in business or intellectual property or family law or what have you, Gonzaga is educating the full person to engage within the community. How does understanding of the themes that we're talking about, whether it's with the Civil and Human Rights Center, through your classroom opportunities, through your presentations, your publications, this book, how does this better our search for racial equality?
Boy,
that's a big question.
That's a big question. How much time do we have?
Yeah, as much as you want.
You know, we were talking a little bit earlier about, you know, the arc of history, and, you know, Martin Luther King, of course, famously said that the arc of history bends towards justice. And I think that's true, but it takes a lot of work for us to get there. We have to be constantly fighting for that to happen. And we're going to have setbacks. I mean, I think that's just the way this business works. 2 steps forward, one step backwards.
Well, so not a straight line.
It's not a straight line. And so I think there are lessons, though. I mean, one of the reasons I do legal history is because I think it does inform where we are right now at the present. And I deal a lot with racial issues in this book. I deal a lot with racial issues in other areas. But I think that there are some lessons that we can learn even from, as we were talking about earlier, the relationship between the lawyer and the woman who sought to be free. It would be, maybe it's idealistic right now to think that people will step outside of their echo chambers on cable news and their Facebook posts and take a moment to get to know somebody who's different from them they are. But that's really how we're going to move forward, right? Is to get to know those people who are different from us in our communities, recognize the common humanity, and move forward.
But what was striking to me, not only today in our conversation, but at your book launch, is this concept of fleshing out these ideas, these ideals, between the attorneys of this era and why they were or weren't taking cases, or why they should or shouldn't take cases. That struck me at the book launch, because I don't think that's any different than today. Again, you might change the name or phrases of this issue or that issue, but it still, as you said, holds true as examples in everyday practical legal practice as to the question why. Why are you taking this case? Why should you take this case? And what is trying to be accomplished with this case?
I mean, I admire greatly my criminal law colleagues, those who in particular do the defense work, because, you know, you're dealing with people who, you know, who are accused, at least, of committing some very serious affronts to our society. And to go into the courtroom every day and represent them to the fullest is, I think, an admirable quality. And you know what? If you talk to those people, and I'm sure you can back me up on this, these become real people, right? They're not just the accused. They're not just a defendant. This is a real person with a real life story.
Yep, a real background that led to the events that you're discussing.
Right, and I think that's about who we are at the law school, is really, helping people to understand and appreciate.
And challenge their own thinking.
Exactly.
What are some of the projects that you have going right now? You have a long history of scholarship. What entices you next?
What's
you have a lot on your plate as it is. But
I think a couple of things, if I can. I mean, the Center for Civil and Human Rights is really at the forefront right now. It's really all-encompassing in many respects. And one of the exciting opportunities that we're having is our center launch, which will take place on Friday, September 28th, with an all-day conference. And we're bringing in experts from around the country to speak about issues of civil and human rights. And so we're really excited about that. It's really looking forward to it. The other project, though, outside of the center is I'm a committed scholar and researcher. And so I have a project that I'm working on right now that actually comes out of California and the gold rush era, 1848, 1849. And it ties into my previous work.
I was going to say, in terms of the timeline, you're right in the middle there.
But what it involves is people who are coming out to California to strike it rich. But keep in mind, it wasn't just, people from New York or Connecticut. It was also people from Mississippi and Alabama. And often the people from Mississippi and Alabama would come to California with 2 or 3 enslaved persons to help in the gold mines. Well, California enters the Union as a free state, but you have all these slaves in California. So as well as I do, it's going to result in litigation, right? We're going to try and figure out, okay, are these people slave? Are they free? What does the new Constitution mean? And so I'm digging around on a case that made it up to the California Supreme Court, in which these issues were at play.
Well, I'll certainly second the fact that you've illustrated how relevant researching history and the examples and stories and documentation is extremely relevant today for practicing lawyers, students, in creating that engagement in our community. And I think it's noteworthy that when you look at the breadth of your presentations, it's not isolated in any respect to the Pacific Northwest or any particular region. You've presented all over the country.
Right.
And to me, that goes to that engagement that not only yourself and your passion, but Gonzaga Law is trying to engage with our country and internationally to bring these issues to the forefront, again, to educate the whole person. I thank you very much for your time and appreciate it. Another episode of the Scholar Series here at Gonzaga Law with Professor Jason Gillmer. Thank you.
Thanks very much.